The heavy steel door clanged shut, echoing down the concrete corridor like a verdict that would never stop repeating. It was a sound Demetrius Terrence Frazier would never forget, the sound that marked the beginning of his life on Alabama's death row. In 1991, Frazier had been convicted for the murder of Pauline Brown in Birmingham, a crime that sent shockwaves through the state. He was 26 years old, athletic, soft-spoken, and still clinging to belief that somehow the truth would set him free. But the courtroom's fluorescent lights told a different story. When the judge read the words "death by lethal injection," Frazier didn't flinch. He simply lowered his head as the courtroom went silent, a silence that followed him all the way to Holman Correctional Facility. The prison guards led him through a maze of echoing hallways, past layers of barbed wire, and watchtowers that cut against the dusk sky. Holman was known across the South as a house of pain, a place where time crawls slower than anywhere else on Earth. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, metal, and something darker, despair. Each man there lived beneath a shadow that stretched longer than a sentence. To the left, a row of steel doors lined the block, each containing someone waiting to die. The cell assigned to Frazier was barely 8 feet by 10, a thin mattress, a metal sink, and a small window high enough that he couldn't see the outside world. The walls carried carvings from those who came before, names, dates, prayers, and sometimes last words. On his first night, a voice from another cell whispered through the vents, "Welcome to the row." It wasn't a greeting. It was a warning, a promise that what lay ahead wasn't life, but a slow-motion death. Days blurred into nights. The lights never truly went out, bathing the block in a constant fluorescent haze that robbed the men of any sense of time. The noise was relentless. Steel clanks, distant screams, and the endless hum of ventilation fans. Some men coped by singing hymns. Others talked to the walls until their voices broke. Frazier stayed silent. He learned that silence was safer than hope. Letters from his mother arrived every few weeks, the only fragments of the world outside. She always signed them the same way. God forgives, even if the world don't. He read those words until the ink faded, then tucked each letter beneath his pillow. Sometimes he'd trace her handwriting with his finger, as if touching her could erase the concrete between them. But forgiveness was hard to find here. Around him, the block lived and breathed in cycles of fear. Every few months, a man's name would echo down the hallway. Guards would arrive with calm precision, escorting him to the death watch cells near the execution chamber. For 3 days, the condemned man would wait, under constant light, under constant watch, before being led to the gurney. The rest of the inmates would hear the radio silence that followed. No music, no noise, just a heavy hum of air conditioning cutting through the stillness. That's when it hit. One of them was gone. Frazier had seen it happen to others long before he fully accepted it would happen to him. One night, the man in the next cell, a quiet, middle-aged prisoner named Curtis, started laughing uncontrollably. The guards tried to calm him, but Curtis wouldn't stop. "You can't kill what's already dead," he shouted, before collapsing into tears. The next morning, his cell was empty. The faint smell of disinfectant replaced him. The system didn't pause. Lunch came as usual. Life on the road continued, indifferent and endless. Weeks turned into months. Frazier began to count the days by the pattern of the guards' footsteps and the passing of breakfast trays. Hope came in strange forms, a delayed appeal, a new warden, even the rumor of a lawsuit challenging the state's execution protocol. But those flickers of optimism were dangerous. The row had a way of turning hope into cruelty. To survive, he built a routine. Push-ups at dawn, scripture reading before lights out, and a letter every Sunday, even if there was no one left to write to. He became a student of silence. The other inmates came to respect his calm. They called him preacher, even though he never preached. He just listened. To their fears, their regrets, their confessions whispered through concrete walls. One night, the power went out. For the first time in years, the row was completely dark. No buzzing lights, no mechanical hum, just blackness and the sound of breathing. Frazier sat up, heart pounding, realizing how rare true darkness was. For a few seconds, he could almost imagine he wasn't in prison. He could almost imagine freedom. But then the backup generators kicked in, and the light flooded back, harsh and unforgiving. Reality returned with the sound of metal doors resetting. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "The worst part isn't dying. It's learning to live while already dead." Frazier didn't know then that he would spend more than 30 years behind those walls. 30 years of appeals, denials, and waiting for a date that would eventually arrive. Not with warning, but with precision. But on that first night, sitting on a thin mattress under humming lights, he began to understand what every man on death row must face, that the true punishment wasn't the needle, it was the waiting. Years drifted by inside Holman, like slow-moving smoke that never cleared. The first winter turned into 10, and Demetrius Frazier stopped counting the days after he lost track of how many wardens had come and gone. Each morning began the same way. The squeak of the food cart wheels echoing down the tier, the metallic clang of trays sliding through slots, the faint radio static from a guard's walkie-talkie. The air was thick, humid even in January, and it smelled of bleach and rust. On death row, even the air felt recycled, like it had been breathed too many times before. Frazier's world shrank to the length of his arm span. He learned the sound of every hinge, every call from the cell next to him, every key on the warden's belt. It was a place where nothing changed, and yet everything aged: walls, minds, hope. After his first decade behind the bars, Frazier had grown thin and pale. The muscles that once filled his shirt had withered, and his hair had started to gray near the temples. But his eyes, calm, steady, defiant, were the only part of him untouched by time. He had stopped writing letters to his mother after she passed. The last one he received came 2 months after her funeral, postmarked from his sister. Inside was a note written in shaky pen. "She waited until the end believing you'd come home." Frazier kept that paper hidden inside his Bible, folded between the Book of Job and Psalms 23. Some nights, when the block went quiet, he'd unfold it and read it aloud under his breath, a ritual to remind himself that someone once believed he could still be forgiven. Prison politics on the row were a strange kind of order. There were men who bragged, men who preached, and men who simply broke. The guards played their roles like actors in a script that never ended. Some treated the inmates as less than human, barking orders and laughing when a man flinched. Others showed small kindnesses, an extra milk carton, a few minutes of talk during lockdown. Frazier never forgot those moments. They were proof that empathy could still exist, even here. Then one summer, a new voice joined the block. Marion Bowman Jr., he was younger, loud, and full of nervous energy, always singing gospel tunes that echoed down the row. Bowman had been sentenced for the 2001 murder of Candy Martin, and like Frazier, he carried his guilt and faith in equal measure. The guards called him the choir boy. His voice carried through the night, sometimes trembling, sometimes strong, always desperate. At first, Frazier found it irritating, but as months passed, he began to understand. Bowman wasn't singing to annoy anyone. He was singing to stay alive. Their friendship began with a knock on the wall. 3 soft taps, the inmates' version of a handshake. They began to talk to the vents about everything the outside world had forgotten: baseball, family, food, freedom. Bowman told stories about his mother's fried chicken and his first bicycle. Frazier talked about his daughter, who'd stopped writing him years ago. In those conversations, time loosened its grip. For a few minutes each night, they weren't inmates waiting to die. They were just men remembering how to live. But the row always reminded them where they were. Executions returned like storms, sudden, violent, and impossible to ignore. When a man's name appeared on the list, the entire block felt it. Guards would quietly clear his cell, taking down photos, books, and letters. His belongings were stored in boxes, tagged and locked away. Then came the silence, the eerie calm that fell over the prison on death watch nights. The fluorescent lights burned brighter. The air grew colder. The rest of the row waited in near total silence, listening for the sound of chains clinking down the hall. In 2022, Alabama tested a new execution method, nitrogen hypoxia, claiming it was painless. The idea terrified everyone. Rumors spread that the condemned would suffocate slowly while conscious, that the mask could malfunction, that no doctor wanted to be there when it happened. Frazier read every legal article. he could get his hands on. He knew that one day his name would be the next on that list. But he didn't fear the method. He feared the waiting that came before it. He began to write again. Not letters this time, but journal entries. Lines like, I measure my life in appeals and meals. And the road doesn't kill you. It just convinces you you're already dead. He shared those words with Bowman through whispers and notes folded into matchstick wrappers. Bowman started reading them aloud to the other inmates, turning Frazier's words into quiet sermons. It wasn't preaching. It was survival through storytelling. The outside world barely noticed the men on the row. News channels covered high-profile trials and political debates, but the slow machinery of death, the appeals, the denials, the quiet despair, never made the headlines. For most Americans, execution was just a number at the end of a newscast. But for Frazier, every one of those numbers had a name, a laugh, a story. He remembered them all. The ones who prayed, the ones who cursed, the ones who faced death singing. Sometimes, late at night, Bowman would whisper to the vent, "You think God still hears us in here?" And Frazier would answer, "Maybe he's the only one who does." Years folded into decades. The two men grew older together in the narrow stretch of hallway that separated them. Appeals came and went like the seasons. Some denied in a single paragraph. Others dragged through courts for years. Hope became a ritual, disappointment a habit. And still, every morning, the same sound. The squeal of the cart, the rattle of keys, the voice of a guard muttering names like roll call for ghosts. One day, Bowman's cell fell silent. No singing, no praying. Frazier knew what that meant before the guards came. Marion Bowman Jr. had been moved to the death watch cell. He was scheduled for execution by lethal injection at the end of the month. When the lights dimmed that night, Frazier wrote one more line in his notebook. The hardest part isn't dying. It's hearing someone else go first. The next morning, a guard walked past his cell and stopped. "You next on the list, Frazier," he said, half smiling. Frazier looked up slowly. "Then I guess it's almost over," he replied. Outside, dawn painted the sky in pale orange light. Inside, death row remained exactly as it had always been, cold, silent, and waiting. The morning of February 6, 2025, began like any other day inside Holman Correctional Facility. Gray skies over razor wire, the low hum of the generators, the faint shuffle of guards changing shifts. But for Demetrius Terrence Frazier, it was the day the waiting ended. After more than 30 years on death row, his final appeal had been denied. No clemency, no delay. The order was signed. That evening, Alabama would carry out his execution using the newly approved method of nitrogen hypoxia, a process state officials called humane and efficient. In the small cell known as the Death Watch, Frazier sat quietly at the edge of his bed. The space was cleaner than the others. Freshly painted walls, a single bulb burning overhead. A Bible lay open on his lap, though he wasn't reading. He just traced his finger over the same line from Psalms he'd memorized years ago. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Outside, footsteps echoed. Guards whispered orders. Reporters gathered behind the prison fence. Cameras waiting for the statement that would come after it was done. At 9 a.m., the warden visited. "You'll have 2 hours for final calls," he said softly. Frazier nodded. He didn't call anyone. The people he'd once loved, his mother, his sister, his daughter, were long gone or had moved on. Instead, he spent his last hours writing. His final note, short and simple, read, "Tell my story. Tell them we were still human." As the sun dipped low, the ritual began. 2 correctional officers entered his cell, reading from a printed order. He stood without resistance. His wrists were cuffed, ankles chained. The clinking of metal against tile echoed like a funeral bell. A chaplain walked beside him, whispering scripture under his breath. Down the hall, the execution chamber glowed with white light through a narrow window. On the other side of the glass, witnesses took their seats, journalists, state officials, a few members of the victim's family. The room was sterile, quiet, almost surgical. A gurney sat in the center, surrounded by tubes, monitors, and the nitrogen mask that would end his life. Unlike lethal injection, There were no needles this time, just a clear designed to cut off oxygen, flooding his lungs with pure nitrogen. To the state, it was progress. To many others, it was an experiment. "Do you have any final words?" the warden asked. Frazier turned his head toward the glass, his voice steady. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I just want peace for me, for her, for all of us." The chaplain placed a hand on his shoulder. Technicians adjusted the straps around his chest and arms, sealing the mask over his face. He inhaled once, deeply. Then the hiss began, soft at first, then louder, filling the chamber with the sound of escaping air. For 30 seconds, Frazier's chest rose and fell. Then his body went still. The doctor checked his pulse and nodded. At 6:28 p.m., Demetrius Terrence Frazier was pronounced dead. In the witness room, no one spoke. A few reporters scribbled notes. Others just stared through the glass. The warden read a brief statement. "Justice has been served in accordance with the laws of the state of Alabama." Outside, protesters held candles, some chanting prayers, others condemning the system that had kept him alive only to kill him slowly. Back inside the prison, the rest of death row heard the news within minutes. The guards didn't have to say anything. The silence said it all. No singing from the far cells, no tapping on pipes. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of a fly trapped near the window. Bowman's old cell, empty for years, seemed to echo that silence. Frazier's friend was gone, and now so was he. That night, the warden walked the row. He went peaceful, he told one inmate. Didn't fight it. But peace was a word that didn't fit the place. On the walls, graffiti from long-dead inmates still read things like, "God is here," and "the waiting is worse." The system would clean Frazier's cell by morning, repaint it, and assign it to another man on the list. The cycle will begin again, the next story, the next countdown, the next name. In the official record, Frazier's death was listed as uneventful. But to those who had known him, the chaplain, the guards who'd spoken with him for decades, the few surviving prisoners who'd shared the same hallway, his passing was more than procedure. It was the quiet conclusion of a lifetime spent suspended between punishment and redemption. Weeks later, his final letter surfaced. It was found folded inside his Bible and given to a prison counselor. The last line read, "The death row I knew wasn't about who we killed. It was about who we became while waiting to die." That sentence would later appear in a small newspaper article buried beneath headlines about politics and crime. Most people skipped over it, but for few who read it, those words stayed. A reminder that behind every execution order, behind every name on a list, there's still a beating heart, waiting for the inevitable sound of the final door closing. As night fell over Holman, the corridor lights dimmed. Somewhere deep in the prison, a clock ticked softly. The men still in a row stared at the ceiling, whispering prayers not for freedom, but for meaning. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, brushing against the cold concrete walls that held the living and remembered the dead. And in that brief moment between silence and sleep, death row itself seemed to breathe, as if the building knew another story had ended and another was just beginning.